Have you ever been judged so harshly by your appearance that you questioned everything about yourself? Have you ever felt invisible, worthless, like you didn't deserve to breathe the same air as the people around you? Well, let me tell you about the day that changed everything for me. The day I walked into a luxury store looking like I'd just crawled out of a dumpster, only to teach everyone there a lesson they'd never forget. My name is Alex, and this is my story, told through my eyes. I was 17 years old when it happened, standing outside the glass doors of Meridian Luxe, one of the most exclusive boutiques in the city, watching my reflection stare back at me like a stranger. My hoodie was torn at the sleeves, stained with paint and dirt from the art project I'd been working on for 3 days straight without sleep. My jeans had holes that weren't the fashionable kind, and my sneakers were held together with duct tape and hope. My hair was a mess, unwashed for days because I'd been so consumed by my creative process that basic hygiene had become an afterthought. I looked exactly like what people feared most, a homeless teenager with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. But here's the thing that nobody knew, the thing that made this whole situation so incredibly twisted. I had more money in my bank account than most of those salespeople would see in their entire lifetimes combined. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle, not from nervousness about what I was about to buy, but from the anxiety of knowing I didn't look the part. You see, I'd grown up in a world where appearances meant everything, where the cut of your suit determined your worth, where the brand on your shoes spoke louder than the words from your mouth. My parents were tech entrepreneurs who'd sold their startup for an amount that would make your head spin, and they'd raised me to understand that money was just a tool, not an identity. They taught me to dress comfortably, to value creativity over conformity, to judge people by their character rather than their bank statements. But the rest of the world hadn't gotten that memo, especially not the staff at Meridian Luxe. I pushed open the door and immediately the atmosphere shifted like I'd just released a toxic gas into the room. The air conditioning hit my face, carrying with it the scent of expensive leather, designer perfume, and something else, the unmistakable smell of judgment and disgust. 3 sales associates stood near the counter, their perfectly pressed uniforms screaming elegance and superiority, and the moment their eyes landed on me, I watched their expressions transform from professional courtesy to barely concealed revulsion. It was like watching masks slip off faces, revealing the ugly truth underneath. The closest one, a woman in her 30s with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, actually took a step backward, her hand instinctively moving to her chest, as if I might lunge at her and steal the pearl necklace she was wearing. I could see her nostrils flare slightly, as if she could smell poverty on me, as if my appearance had somehow contaminated the sanitized air of their precious store. I felt my stomach clench, that familiar sensation of humiliation beginning to creep up my spine like cold fingers. But I pushed forward anyway because I'd come here for a reason, a very specific reason that nobody could have guessed by looking at me. The silence that followed my entrance was deafening, broken only by the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers and the clicking of heels, as another associate approached, not to help me, but to guard the merchandise like I was a threat to their inventory. I'd experienced this before, of course, the suspicious stares when I walked into high-end establishments, the way security guards would suddenly materialize nearby, the passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. But something about today felt different, more intense, more painful, because I was already running on empty emotionally. The past week had been brutal. I'd been working on a massive art installation for a gallery showing, pouring every ounce of my soul into creating something meaningful, something that spoke to the invisible people in our society, the ones we walk past without seeing, the ones we judge without knowing. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd essentially become one of those invisible people in my quest to represent them. I hadn't slept properly in days, existing on coffee and creative adrenaline, and I'd completely lost track of time until my phone reminder dinged this morning, telling me that today was my mother's birthday. My mom, the woman who'd given me everything, who'd supported my artistic dreams even when everyone else told me to be practical, who'd taught me that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the richness of your experiences and the depth of your compassion. I'd completely forgotten about her birthday gift, and I knew exactly what she wanted. A specific designer handbag she'd mentioned months ago, not because she was materialistic, but because it represented something to her, a milestone, a symbol of how far she'd come from her own humble beginnings. The bag was here, at Meridian Luxe, and I was determined to get it no matter how much these people looked at me like I was trash that had accidentally blown in through their pristine doors. I approached the main display area where I'd seen the bag online, trying to ignore the way the sales associates were whispering to each other, their voices low, but not low enough to hide their disdain. I caught fragments of their conversation, words like security, probably high, don't let him touch anything, and each word was like a small knife stabbing into my already fragile sense of self-worth. Have you ever felt so judged that you started to doubt your own reality? That's exactly where I was in that moment, questioning whether I should just leave, whether this gift was worth the humiliation, whether my appearance really did make me less deserving of basic human respect. The handbag I was looking for sat on a pedestal under perfect lighting, like a piece of art in a museum, which in a way, it was. The craftsmanship was incredible, hand-stitched Italian leather in a deep burgundy color that my mom would absolutely love, with gold hardware that caught the light in the most beautiful way. The price tag wasn't visible, but I knew from my research it cost somewhere around $15,000, a ridiculous amount of money for a bag. But that wasn't the point. The point was making my mom smile, showing her that I paid attention, that despite my chaotic artistic lifestyle and my tendency to lose myself in projects, I remembered what mattered to her. I reached out to touch the leather, just to feel the quality, and that's when everything escalated from uncomfortable to absolutely hostile. The sharp cheekboned woman, whose name tag read Clarissa, practically lunged forward, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Excuse me, please don't touch the merchandise with dirty hands," she said, and the emphasis on the word dirty was so loaded with contempt that I actually flinched. I looked down at my hands, seeing them as she must have seen them, paint under the fingernails, calluses from handling art supplies, a small cut on my thumb from where I'd caught it on a canvas frame. They were the hands of someone who created things, who worked with their hands, who valued substance over superficial cleanliness, but to her, they were just dirty, unworthy of touching something precious. I pulled my hand back, feeling my face flush with embarrassment, and mumbled an apology that I immediately regretted because why was I apologizing for existing in a public store? Another associate, younger this time, maybe mid-20s with blonde hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, chimed in with a fake sweetness that was somehow worse than outright rudeness. "Sweetie, this section is for our premium customers. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at our, more accessible items." She gestured vaguely toward a corner of the store where they apparently kept cheaper merchandise, her smile never reaching her eyes, which remained cold and dismissive. The condescension in her voice made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe through the anger and hurt that was building in my chest, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them exactly who I was and what I could afford, but something held me back. Maybe pride, maybe curiosity about just how far they'd take this judgment, maybe a masochistic need to fully experience the discrimination that so many people face every single day, based solely on their appearance. I straightened my spine, trying to summon whatever dignity I had left, and looked Clarissa directly in the eyes. "I'm interested in purchasing this handbag," I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside, pointing to the burgundy beauty that had started this whole nightmare. The effect of my words was immediate, and almost comical if it wasn't so deeply painful. Clarissa's perfectly shaped eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline, and she exchanged a look with her blonde colleague that was a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and something that looked almost like pity. It was the kind of look adults give children who claim they're going to buy a spaceship, indulgent but ultimately dismissive, like my aspirations were cute but completely detached from reality. The blonde one actually let out a small laugh, quickly covering it with a cough, but not quickly enough. I saw it, heard it, felt it cut through me like glass. "That particular piece is $15,800, Clarissa said slowly, enunciating each word as if I might not understand numbers, or perhaps as if saying the price out loud would make me realize my mistake and scurry back to wherever I came from. She crossed her arms over her chest, her body language screaming skepticism and barely contained mockery. I could see a third associate in the background, an older man with silver hair and an expensive suit, watching this interaction with interest, like we were performers in a show put on for his entertainment. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd stepped into some twisted social experiment designed to test how much humiliation one person could endure before breaking. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That distinctive thud-thud-thud that accompanies moments of extreme stress, when your body is preparing for fight or flight, and you're not sure which way you're going to go. I thought about my mom again, about the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, about the sacrifices she'd made throughout her life, about the lessons she'd taught me about character and kindness. She would be horrified if she knew what I was going through right now, but she'd also be proud that I was standing my ground, refusing to be made small by people who measured worth in thread count and brand names. I understand the price, I replied, keeping my voice level even though inside I was a storm of emotions, swirling between anger, hurt, and a strange determination to see this through to whatever end awaited me. I'd like to purchase it. Today. Now. I emphasized the words, making my intention crystal clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation, though I knew they'd find a way to twist it anyway. Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line, and I could practically see the calculations happening behind her eyes. She was trying to decide how to get rid of me without causing a scene, how to protect her store from someone she'd already convicted in her mind of being a potential thief or troublemaker, despite the fact that I'd done nothing except exist in their space with the wrong aesthetic. The blonde associate leaned in and whispered something to Clarissa, their heads close together like conspirators, and even though I couldn't hear the exact words, I caught enough. Just call security. Wasting our time. Probably doesn't even have $50. Each phrase was a punch to my gut, confirming what I already knew, that they'd judged every single thing about me based on my appearance, creating an entire narrative about who I was, where I came from, what I deserved, without knowing the first true thing about my life. It's funny how we do that as humans, how we fill in gaps in our knowledge with assumptions that usually say more about our own prejudices than about the person we're judging. These women looked at my torn clothes and unwashed hair and decided I was worthless, decided I was a problem to be solved, decided I didn't belong in their carefully curated world of luxury and exclusivity. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know just by looking at me, was that I'd been raised by parents who started with nothing, who built an empire through innovation and hard work, who taught me that the clothes on your back are just fabric and that real value comes from what you create, what you contribute, how you treat others. My father used to tell me stories about the early days of their company, when he'd go to investor meetings in his only suit, the one with the frayed cuffs that he'd bought at a thrift store, and how many doors had been slammed in his face by people who thought he didn't look successful enough to be worth their time. Those rejections had fueled him, made him more determined, and ultimately the very people who dismissed him had come crawling back when his company went public and made headlines. He'd taught me that lesson early, that people who judge by appearances are revealing their own limitations, not yours, but knowing that intellectually and experiencing the emotional reality of discrimination are two very different things. And right now, the emotional reality was crushing me from the inside out. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them back furiously because I'd be damned if I'd give these people the satisfaction of seeing me cry, of confirming their belief that I was weak, that I didn't belong, that I was somehow less than them. Clarissa took a deep breath, composing herself into what I recognized as her dealing with a difficult customer persona, the one she probably reserved for people who complained about prices or asked too many questions. "Look," she said, her tone shifting to something that was probably meant to sound patient but came across as deeply patronizing. "I appreciate your interest, but perhaps you don't understand what $15,000 actually means. That's not money you pay with cash you've been saving in a jar. That's serious money that requires serious financial means. We cater to a very specific clientele here, and I'm not sure you're aware of the kind of customers we typically serve." The implication was clear. I wasn't the kind of customer they served. I was the kind of customer they wanted to escort out as quickly as possible before I scared off the real clients, the ones who showed up in designer clothes and luxury cars, who fit the image of wealth that their store wanted to project. What she didn't realize was that many of the wealthiest people I knew, including my own parents, often dressed down specifically to avoid this kind of pretentious treatment, preferring authenticity and comfort over performative displays of affluence. My mom's best friend was a billionaire who wore the same ratty jeans and college sweatshirt everywhere she went, and my dad had been known to show up to business meetings in cargo shorts when the weather was hot, much to the horror of more traditional corporate types. They taught me that real confidence doesn't require external validation, that you don't need to prove your worth to anyone, that the people who matter will see your value regardless of how you're dressed. But standing there in Meridian Lux, covered in paint and exhaustion, facing down these judgmental strangers who'd decided I was nothing before I'd even opened my mouth, those lessons felt abstract and far away, like philosophical concepts that couldn't quite bridge the gap between theory and the gut-wrenching reality of being treated as less than human. I wanted to teleport out of there to be anywhere else, but I also wanted to stand my ground, to prove something, though I wasn't entirely sure anymore whether I was trying to prove something to them or to myself. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right but felt completely powerless, where the truth of who you are clashed so violently with others' perceptions that you started to question your own reality? That's where I was, caught between my knowledge of my own worth and their absolute certainty that I was worthless, and the dissonance was physically painful, creating a tension in my body that made my muscles ache and my head throb. The silver-haired man I'd noticed earlier finally approached our little tableau, his movements measured and deliberate, like a principal coming to break up a schoolyard dispute. He positioned himself slightly behind Clarissa and the blonde associate, a position that communicated support for his staff while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct confrontation with me. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk and just as artificial, the kind of voice that had been trained to handle difficult situations without ever revealing genuine emotion. Clarissa turned to him with an expression of relief, like a student eager to report misbehavior to a teacher. "Hastings, this young man is insisting he wants to purchase the Valentina collection piece, but I don't think he understands the price point or our store's policies regarding payment methods and customer verification." Customer verification? There it was. The coded language that really meant we don't think he has money and we want to check before we waste any more of our valuable time on him. "Mister." Hastings looked me up and down, his gaze traveling from my duct-taped sneakers to my paint-stained hoodie, taking in every detail of my disheveled appearance, and I could see him arriving at the same conclusion his staff had reached, that I was a problem to be managed, not a customer to be served. But there was something in his expression that was different from the outright contempt I'd seen in Clarissa and her colleague. It was more calculated, more professional, but no less dismissive. He was better at hiding his judgment, but it was still there, lurking beneath the surface of his practiced customer service demeanor. "I see," he said slowly, and then to me, "Young man, I'm sure you can appreciate that we have to be careful in our establishment. We've had incidents in the past with, shall we say, overly enthusiastic window shoppers who perhaps get carried away with aspirational shopping. We require valid payment methods and identification for all purchases over $10,000. Do you have a credit card and valid ID?" The way he phrased it made it sound reasonable, like standard business practice, but his tone carried an unspoken message. "We both know you don't have these things, so let's stop pretending and end this charade." I felt anger flare hot in my chest, burning away some of the hurt and embarrassment I'd been drowning in, because how dare they assume? How dare they decide who I was without giving me a chance to show them? How dare they treat me like a criminal for the crime of not looking like their typical customer? My hand moved to my pocket, fingers closing around the slim wallet I kept there, the one made of simple canvas because I'd never seen the point in expensive accessories when a $10 wallet did the same job as a $1,000 one. Inside that wallet was something these people couldn't have anticipated, something that was about to flip this entire situation on its head and expose their prejudice in the most dramatic way possible. But before I pulled it out, I hesitated because once I did this, once I revealed what I was about to reveal, there would be no going back. This moment would become a story, a lesson, a turning point, and some part of me wanted to savor it, to remember every detail of their expressions before everything changed. I thought about all the people who'd never get this moment, who'd walk out of stores like this with their heads down, who'd internalize the message that they weren't good enough, who'd let other people's judgments shape their sense of self-worth. I thought about the art installation I'd been working on, the one about invisible people, and realized that I'd been researching by living, by experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated as if you didn't matter. There was a weird kind of validation in that, a sense that my suffering had purpose, that this humiliation could be transformed into something meaningful, into art that might make people think twice before judging someone by their appearance. But that intellectual understanding didn't make the emotional pain any less real, didn't erase the sting of Clarissa's disgust, or the blonde associate's mocking laugh, or Mr. Hastings's barely concealed skepticism. I was still a 17-year-old kid who'd come to buy his mom a birthday present and gotten treated like garbage in the process, and no amount of artistic justification could completely smooth over those wounds. My hand tightened around the wallet, and I made my decision. I would show them. I would pull out that card and watch their faces transform, and maybe, just maybe, they'd learn something from this experience, though I wasn't naive enough to believe that one moment of shock would fundamentally change who they were or how they treated people. But for me, for this moment, for my mom's birthday gift and my own sense of dignity, I would do this. I would show them exactly how wrong they'd been, and I would walk out of this store with that burgundy handbag and a story I'd never forget. "I have what you need," I said, my voice quiet but firm, and I slowly pulled the wallet from my pocket, watching their eyes track the movement like they expected me to pull out a weapon or run for the door. I opened it carefully, deliberately, drawing out the moment because after everything they'd put me through, they could wait a few extra seconds. I reached into one of the card slots, feeling the distinctive weight and texture of the metal card between my fingers, and then I pulled it out and held it up for them to see. The effect was instantaneous and almost comical in its intensity. Clarissa's jaw literally dropped, her mouth falling open in an O of shock that she couldn't quite hide behind her professional facade. The blonde associate's eyes went wide as saucers, and she took a step forward as if she needed to verify what she was seeing, as if her brain couldn't process the disconnect between my appearance and what I was holding. Mr. Hastings' carefully maintained composure cracked, just for a second but long enough for me to see the flash of realization cross his face, the understanding that he'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. In my hand, catching the boutique's expensive lighting in a way that made it gleam like something otherworldly, was a Centurion card, the American Express black card, the one that's invitation only, that requires you to charge at least $250,000 a year on it, that comes with a price tag of $10,000 just to possess it. It wasn't even my card technically, it was my dad's, but he'd gotten me an authorized user card when I turned 16, telling me it was a tool for emergencies and important purchases, and that with great financial power came great responsibility. This qualified as important, and I'd be willing to bet my dad would understand and approve when I told him the whole story later, especially the part about buying Mom's birthday present. I held the card out toward Clarissa, whose face had now gone from shock to something that looked almost like horror, the kind of expression people get when they realize they've just made a catastrophic error in judgment that might cost them their job. "Will this work?" I asked, and I couldn't quite keep the edge out of my voice, couldn't quite suppress the satisfaction I felt at watching their certainty crumble, at seeing them realize they'd judged me completely wrong. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, weighted with implications that went far beyond a simple retail transaction. Clarissa reached for the card with trembling fingers, and I noticed that her perfectly manicured hand was actually shaking as she took it from me, as if the card itself was evidence of her colossal failure of judgment, and holding, it was an indictment. She stared at it for a long moment, probably checking for signs that it was fake, but the Centurion card is almost impossible to counterfeit, with its distinctive black design, the Centurion image, the unmistakable weight of metal rather than plastic. I watched her run her thumb over the embossed numbers, saw her eyes flick to my face and then back to the card, as if she was trying to reconcile the two, trying to understand how someone who looked like me could possibly possess something like this. The blonde associate had gone pale, her earlier smirk completely erased, replaced by an expression I recognized as dawning dread, the realization that she'd mocked someone who could probably buy the entire store without making a dent in their bank account. Mr. Hastings cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet, and stepped forward with a smile that was trying so hard to be warm and welcoming, but came across as desperate and fake. "I apologize for any confusion," he began, his voice now dripping with the kind of obsequious courtesy he should have shown me from the beginning. "We simply have to be careful, you understand? Security measures and all that. Clarissa, please help this young gentleman with his purchase immediately." The shift in his demeanor was whiplash-inducing, from barely concealed contempt to exaggerated respect in the space of seconds, and it made me feel simultaneously vindicated and disgusted. This was what it took: a piece of metal, a symbol of wealth, to be treated with basic human decency, and that realization sat heavy in my stomach like a stone. Clarissa moved toward the burgundy handbag with mechanical precision, her training kicking in even as her face remained a mask of mortification, and the blonde associate had actually backed away, as if proximity to me might somehow make her culpable for their collective mistake. I followed Clarissa to the counter, my torn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor, a sound that now seemed almost triumphant rather than shameful, and I watched as she carefully removed the handbag from its pedestal, with a reverence that hadn't been there before. She placed it on the counter between us, the leather gleaming under the lights, and began the process of ringing up the purchase with a level of attentiveness that was almost laughable given how she'd treated me just minutes before. "Would you like this gift wrapped?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain, so different from the sharp, contemptuous tone she'd used earlier, and I could hear the unspoken apology in every syllable, though she hadn't actually said the words, "I'm sorry," and I wondered if she ever would, if her pride would allow her to acknowledge what she'd done. "Yes, please," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Not because I'd forgiven her, but because I was tired, bone-deep tired from the lack of sleep and the emotional roller coaster of the past hour, and the weight of knowing that this experience, as painful as it had been, was just a glimpse of what so many people dealt with every single day of their lives. She nodded and retrieved a beautiful burgundy box with gold accents, carefully placing the handbag inside with tissue paper and ribbon, her movements practiced and precise, the kind of service I should have received from the moment I walked in the door. The blonde associate had disappeared entirely, probably retreating to the back room to process what had happened, or maybe to panic about whether she'd face consequences for her behavior, and Mr. Hastings hovered nearby, trying to make small talk about the quality of the merchandise and the exclusivity of the brand, his words washing over me without really registering because I was somewhere else in my head, thinking about what this moment meant and what I wanted to do with it. When Clarissa slid the card reader toward me, I noticed she couldn't quite meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on the transaction screen as if the numbers there were the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen, and I understood that she was ashamed, genuinely ashamed, but whether that shame would translate into actual change or just discomfort until the memory faded, I couldn't know. I inserted the card, entered my PIN, and waited for the approval that I knew would come, and in those few seconds of processing, I thought about power and privilege, and the absurd lottery of birth that had given me access to resources most people would never have, and how easily that could have been reversed, how I could have been someone who actually was struggling, who actually couldn't afford the bag, who actually deserved kindness and respect anyway, because every human being deserves those things regardless of their financial situation. The transaction approved with a soft beep, and Clarissa printed the receipt with hands that had stopped shaking, but still moved with an uncharacteristic hesitancy, as if she was afraid I might suddenly change my mind or berate her for her earlier behavior. She placed the receipt on the counter along with my card, and then, finally, the words I'd been waiting for. "I apologize for any inconvenience," she said, and even though it was the corporate version of an apology, the kind that didn't actually admit wrongdoing, I could hear something genuine underneath it, a real understanding that she'd been cruel and unjust. I picked up my card and slid it back into my canvas wallet, then reached for the beautiful gift box that held my mom's present, the thing I'd come here for in the first place, and I felt a complex mixture of emotions, triumph, yes, but also sadness, anger, disappointment in humanity, and a renewed commitment to treating people better than I'd been treated here today. Mr. Hastings stepped forward one more time, his hand extended for a handshake that I considered refusing but ultimately accepted because I was raised to be polite, even when others weren't, and he gripped my hand with an enthusiasm that was borderline aggressive, as if the firmness of his handshake could somehow erase the past hour. "Thank you for your business, and please come back any time," he said, and I nodded without committing to anything, because the likelihood of me voluntarily returning to this store after today's experience was exactly zero. I walked toward the door, the gift box tucked under my arm, and I could feel their eyes on my back, watching me leave, probably having a frantic conversation the moment the door closed behind me about what had just happened and whether they needed to worry about complaints to corporate or bad reviews online. The door opened with its soft chime, and I stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, the warmth hitting my face like a blessing, like a return to the real world after being trapped in some bizarre alternate reality where your worth as a human being was determined by the brand of your clothing and the style of your hair. I stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, feeling the weight of the experience settle into my bones, knowing it would stay with me forever, become part of my story, shape how I saw the world, and how I moved through it. I thought about Clarissa and the blonde associate and Mr. Hastings, wondered what they were thinking now, whether they felt guilty or just annoyed that they'd been caught in their prejudice, whether this would change how they treated the next person who walked in looking less than perfect, or whether they'd just be more careful about judging until they'd verified payment methods first. I wanted to believe people could change, could learn from their mistakes, could grow past their biases, but I'd also seen enough of the world to know that real change is rare and difficult, and requires a level of self-reflection that many people never achieve. Maybe one of them would think about this moment late at night and feel ashamed enough to do better. Maybe they'd all forget about it by next week, chalking it up to an anomaly, an exception that proved the rule rather than challenged it. I didn't know and couldn't control their reactions, but I could control my own response to what had happened, could choose what to do with this experience, how to let it shape me without letting it break me. I started walking toward my car, which I'd parked several blocks away because I actually enjoyed walking and hadn't wanted to deal with the parking situation near the boutique. And as I walked, I felt the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, leaving behind exhaustion and a strange sort of clarity. The art installation I'd been working on suddenly felt more important than ever, because if people could judge me so harshly despite all my advantages, despite my safety net of family wealth and support, what must it be like for people who actually were homeless, who actually were struggling, who actually had nowhere to turn when the world treated them as invisible or worse, as threats to be eliminated? My project was meant to shine a light on that reality, to make visible the people we all pretended not to see. And now I had first-hand experience of what it felt like to be dismissed, to be judged, to be treated as less than human, and that experience would inform my art in ways I couldn't have achieved through imagination alone. There was a gift in that, a terrible, painful gift, but a gift nonetheless, and I would honor it by creating something that mattered, something that made people uncomfortable enough to examine their own prejudices and biases. My mom's birthday dinner was that evening, and I couldn't wait to give her the bag, to see her face light up with joy, to know that despite everything, I'd accomplished what I set out to do. But I also knew I'd tell her the story of how I got it, because my mom wasn't the type of person who'd enjoy a gift without knowing the full context, and she'd want to know about the discrimination I'd faced, would probably want to complain to the store, or write a scathing review, though I'd discourage her from that because I didn't want this to be about revenge or punishment, but about learning and growth. I'd tell her how it felt to be judged so harshly, and she'd understand because she'd faced her own version of that when she and my dad were building their company. When investors saw a young woman with ideas and immediately dismissed her as naive or unqualified, when people assumed my dad was the brains of the operation and she was just along for the ride, when they had to work twice as hard to get half the respect that their male counterparts received automatically. She'd taught me that these experiences, as painful as they are, can either make you bitter or make you better, and the choice is always yours. I chose better. I chose to let this fuel my art, my activism, my commitment to treating everyone I met with the dignity and respect they deserved, regardless of how they looked or what they wore or where they came from. I thought about all the times I'd probably made assumptions about people without even realizing it. Because we all do it. We all carry biases that we've absorbed from society, from media, from our own limited experiences, and the best we can do is try to recognize those biases and challenge them constantly. Today had been a masterclass in what happens when people don't challenge their assumptions, when they let their prejudices run unchecked, when they treat their first impressions as unshakable truth rather than incomplete information waiting to be corrected. I reached my car, a modest sedan that my parents had bought me for my 16th birthday. Nothing flashy because they believed in teaching financial responsibility even when you had money to spare, and I carefully placed the gift box in the passenger seat, making sure it was secure before starting the engine. As I drove home through the city streets, I found myself thinking about the other customers who might have been in Meridian Lux during my visit, the ones who'd probably witnessed at least part of what happened, and I wondered what they'd thought, whether they'd been uncomfortable with how I was being treated or whether they'd simply accepted it as normal and appropriate. We're all complicit when we witness injustice and say nothing, when we see someone being mistreated and turn away because it's not our problem, because getting involved is awkward or uncomfortable or might cause a scene. I thought about the times I'd probably witnessed similar situations and hadn't spoken up, hadn't defended the person being judged, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, because I could have been better, could have been braver, Could have used my privilege to shield others the way I couldn't shield myself today. Because the privilege only worked once people knew it existed. That was the catch-22 of privilege based on wealth. It only protected you once you proved you had it. And until then, you were as vulnerable as anyone else to the cruel judgments of strangers who thought they could assess your worth with a glance. I made a promise to myself right then, sitting at a red light watching people cross the street in front of me, all different shapes and sizes and styles, all carrying their own stories and struggles and triumphs that I couldn't possibly know just by looking at them. I promised that I would speak up next time, that I would challenge injustice when I saw it, that I would use whatever advantages I had to make the world a little bit kinder, a little bit fairer, a little bit more just. It was a small promise in the grand scheme of things, but small promises kept consistently can add up to significant change. Or at least, that's what I had to believe, because the alternative, accepting that people would always judge and discriminate and nothing could be done about it, was too depressing to contemplate. The light turned green, and I pressed the accelerator, moving forward both literally and metaphorically, carrying the lessons of today with me into whatever came next. By the time I got home, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why I loved art in the first place, because beauty exists everywhere if you know how to look for it, even in the midst of pain and struggle and disappointment. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment in the car, looking at the gift box beside me and thinking about everything it represented. Not just a birthday present for my mom, but evidence of a moment that had tested me, and that I'd survived, that had shown me something important about the world and about myself. I grabbed the box and my wallet and keys and headed inside, where I could hear my parents in the kitchen, probably starting dinner preparations, their voices carrying that easy warmth of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, even after decades together. My mom looked up when I walked in, her face breaking into a smile that made every moment of today's humiliation worth it, because that smile was pure love and acceptance, everything the people at Meridian Lux had withheld, and I knew that this right here, was what actually mattered. "Hey honey," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How was your day?" And I laughed, because that was such a loaded question given everything that had happened, and I held up the gift box and said, "I got your present, but I have a story to tell you." She raised her eyebrows, intrigued, and my dad turned from the stove where he was stirring something that smelled amazing, and they both looked at me with that particular expression of parental concern mixed with curiosity that I knew so well. "Is everything okay?" my dad asked, and I nodded because I was okay. Maybe more than okay. Maybe changed in ways that would take time to fully understand, but that felt important and necessary. "Everything's fine," I said, "but I learned something today about judgment and prejudice and what it's like to be invisible." And then I told them the whole story, from walking into the store to pulling out the card, and I watched their faces go through a range of emotions: anger at how I'd been treated, pride that I'd handled it with dignity, concern that I'd been hurt, and understanding because they'd both been there in different ways. When I finished talking, my mom pulled me into a hug and I let myself sink into it, let myself feel all the emotions I'd been holding back, and maybe I cried a little bit, because sometimes you need to release the pressure before you can move forward. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," she said into my hair, and my dad joined the hug, making it a family sandwich that was simultaneously comforting and slightly suffocating in the best way. "But I'm proud of how you handled it," my dad added, "and I hope you know that your worth has nothing to do with what's in your bank account, or what you're wearing, or what anyone else thinks of you. Your worth is inherent, built-in, non-negotiable." I nodded against his shoulder, knowing he was right intellectually but still feeling the emotional wounds from the day, because knowing something and feeling it are different things, and it would take time for the feelings to catch up with the knowledge. We broke apart, and my mom opened the gift box, gasping with delight when she saw the burgundy handbag, holding it up to the light and admiring every detail, and her joy was exactly what I'd hoped for, exactly what I'd wanted to give her. "It's perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect, thank you so much, honey." And then she paused, looking at me with those perceptive mother eyes that always saw more than you wanted them to, and added, "But you're the real gift. You know that, right? Not this bag, not anything you could buy, just you, exactly as you are, paint-stained clothes and duct-taped shoes and beautiful heart included." That made me cry again, Because sometimes the right words at the right moment can crack you open in the best way possible, can remind you of truths you'd temporarily forgotten in the face of the world's cruelty. We had dinner together that night, and I told them more about my art installation, about how today's experience would influence it, about my plans to create something that challenged people to see beyond surfaces, to recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of how they presented themselves. My parents listened and offered suggestions and told their own stories of times they'd been underestimated or dismissed. And I realized that this was a universal experience, that almost everyone at some point has felt the sting of being judged unfairly, and that realizing we're all in this together, all fighting the same battles against prejudice and ignorance and fear, was maybe the first step toward building a better world. The weeks that followed were a blur of creative activity, channeling everything I'd felt that day at Meridian Lux into my art installation, which I titled Invisible Price Tags because it captured the idea that we assign value to people based on arbitrary external markers rather than intrinsic worth. The installation featured life-sized photographs of people from all walks of life, some dressed in expensive clothes and some in thrift store finds, some housed and some homeless, and viewers couldn't see the photos clearly until they stepped right up close, forcing them to approach rather than judge from a distance. Next to each photo was a card with the person's story, revealing that the assumptions viewers made based on appearance were almost always wrong, that the person in designer clothes might be drowning in debt while the person in threadbare jeans might be a millionaire. That external markers told you almost nothing about someone's character, struggles, triumphs, or value as a human being. The installation opened at a local gallery, and the response was overwhelming, with people spending hours reading the stories and examining their own biases. And several viewers told me afterward that it had changed how they saw strangers on the street, made them more aware of their snap judgments and more committed to treating everyone with respect. I included my own story as part of the installation, though anonymously, and people were shocked when they read about the luxury store incident, many of them admitting they'd probably assumed I was a troublemaker if they'd seen me that day. Which was exactly the point. We all make these judgments. We're all capable of cruelty based on insufficient information, and awareness is the first step toward change. The gallery director told me it was one of the most impactful installations they'd ever hosted, and they extended its run by 2 months to accommodate the number of people who wanted to see it. I gave several talks about the project, and each time I told the story of that day at Meridian Lux, I could see people's faces change, as they recognized their own biases reflected back at them, as they understood that they too had probably made similar assumptions, had probably hurt people with their judgments without even realizing it. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome came about 3 months after that day in the store, when I received an email from Clarissa, the sharp-cheekboned sales associate who'd been so contemptuous of me. She'd somehow tracked down my email through the gallery installation, putting together that the anonymous story was mine, and she wrote me a long, heartfelt apology that went far beyond the corporate sorry for any inconvenience she'd offered that day. She told me that the incident had haunted her, that she'd realized she'd been perpetuating the same kind of judgment that had been used against her earlier in her life when she'd been poor and struggling, that she'd somehow forgotten where she came from, in her eagerness to fit into the world of luxury retail. She said she'd attended my installation and cried reading the stories, recognizing herself in the narrow-minded viewers I described, and that she'd decided to make changes in her life, starting with how she treated customers regardless of their appearance. She'd even left Meridian Lux to work at a nonprofit that helped people transitioning out of homelessness find employment, using her retail experience to teach interview skills and professional presentation without losing sight of the fact that clothes don't make the person. Her email was vulnerable and honest in a way that surprised me, and I wrote back thanking her for her apology and telling her that her willingness to change and grow was exactly what I'd hoped the installation might inspire in people. We even met for coffee a few weeks later, and she told me more about her journey, how the shame she'd felt that day had been a catalyst for examining all the ways she'd let prejudice and snobbery creep into her worldview, and how committed she was now to doing better. It was a powerful reminder that people can change, that even painful experiences can lead to growth if we're willing to learn from them, and that extending grace to people who've hurt us doesn't mean excusing their behavior, but rather acknowledging their capacity for transformation. Our conversation was healing for both of us, I think, allowing me to let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying and allowing her to receive the forgiveness she needed to fully move forward. As for me, that experience became a defining moment in my life, shaping not just my art but my entire approach to how I moved through the world. I became more intentional about challenging my own assumptions, about speaking up when I witnessed injustice, about using my privilege to amplify voices that were being ignored or dismissed. I continued making art that explored themes of visibility and worth, each project building on the lessons I'd learned that day in Meridian Lux. My parents' teaching that real wealth isn't measured in dollars but in richness of experience and depth of character became not just an abstract principle, but a lived reality that I tried to embody every day. I started volunteering at a youth center in an underserved part of the city, teaching art classes to kids who reminded me that creativity exists everywhere, regardless of economic circumstances, that talent and potential aren't distributed based on zip codes or bank accounts. I dressed however I wanted, in paint-stained clothes or torn jeans or occasionally in something nicer when the situation called for it. But I never again let others' judgments about my appearance shake my sense of self-worth, because I knew that worth came from within, from the choices I made and the person I was becoming, not from external validation. The burgundy handbag still sits in my mom's closet, used on special occasions, and every time she carries it, we both remember that day and what it taught us about staying true to your values, even when the world tries to tell you that appearances are all that matter. Have you ever had an experience that fundamentally changed how you see the world? Have you ever been judged so harshly that it cracked you open and forced you to examine your own biases? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I truly believe that sharing these experiences, as painful as they might be to recount, helps all of us grow and become more compassionate, more aware, more committed to treating each other with the dignity every human being deserves. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about times you've judged or been judged, if it challenged you to do better going forward, please leave a like on this video because it helps the algorithm share this message with more people who might need to hear it. And if you want to see more content like this, more stories that dig into the complex realities of being human in a world that's often unkind, please subscribe to Through My Eyes and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic experiences, challenging assumptions, and building a community of people who believe in looking beyond surfaces to see the humanity in everyone. Thank you for taking the time to hear my story, for being willing to sit with the uncomfortable truths it reveals, and for being part of a community that values growth and compassion over judgment and prejudice. Remember that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying stories that would surprise you, deserving of respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Let's commit together to being people who see others, really see them, not just their clothes or their hair or their shoes, but their inherent, invaluable, irreplaceable humanity. Until next time, keep looking through your eyes, but also through your heart.